Hi, everybody. My name is Neil Slifka. I work with the Division of Parks and Trails. I'm the area resource specialist out of the Owatonna co-located office at Rice Lake State Park. I'm responsible for resource management activities in the southern region, the eastern half of the southern region. So I've got quite a background in land management and habitat management, as well as trails maintenance, prescribed fire, things like that, invasive species control on lands administered by the Division of Parks and Trails. So I don't work for any park, I work for all parks in our region, but I'm happy to be joining today. We're going to be talking about constructing and maintaining trails in your woodlands. I've got a background that also includes some wildlife and fisheries, as well as forestry work. So I've worked with both private and industrial forest landowners for over a decade, hoping that you'll get some good information here. This is also a good platform for everybody to come up with questions, and we can flesh those out at the question and answer session later. So just to proceed, to give you a little general overview, going to try to keep it succinct. There's a lot of information to cover, and we're never going to cover it all in the amount of time here. But like I said, my hope is that we get some questions developed and can try to address some of those based on the information I present here. Again, it's not going to be covering everything, but it's going to try to hit some key bullet points. So as a general overview, we'll start with some sustainable trail layout and construction information. Then we'll look at some obstacles to trail construction, and hopefully we'll be able to shoot those to the various topographies and geologies across the state, just so that hopefully they cover some of the information more specific to where your woodland or woodlot is. Then we'll go into a little bit of trail maintenance and follow up with some additional resources that I may allude to in this presentation. So I did say sustainable trails in the overview, and I know that's kind of a catchword, but it's becoming more popular in terms of trail design and construction, just really because if we construct a sustainable trail, it is going to be more cost effective in the long run, as well as more ecologically sensitive to the landscape. So in brief, a sustainable trail meets the intended use and purpose of a landowner user group. It has minimal adverse impact to the environment, just recognizing that it's going to have some impact to the environment. The goal is that that impact is not long-term and more related to just the initial clearing and follow-up pruning. So it also requires minimal maintenance in the long term. And part of the reason for it requiring less maintenance than a standard typical constructed trail that we've historically put in is that it keeps water off the trail, minimizes erosion, and it does this by attempting to follow some of the natural contours of the landscape and not running perpendicular or straight up and down the slope. It's going to try to contour the slope. You'll see throughout this presentation that what we're going to be fighting is water. That is probably the biggest struggle with trail maintenance and construction is water on the landscape, and allowing that water to either infiltrate appropriately or shed off in a manner that's not concentrated, picking up velocity and ending up blowing out trail segments or causing some larger problems like gulling and things. So to move into our first section here, sustainable trail layout and construction, we've kind of broken it out into a handful of general steps. I'll just read through them here. A would be identify the need or purpose for constructing a trail. So we could have a variety of reasons, but part of identifying that need or purpose is also identifying your clearing widths and heights and making sure your treadway is is suitable for whatever activity you're doing. B would be to assess or inventory the property. And all that really is getting a good idea of what assets or resources you have on the property. What are your goals for moving across to or between points on the landscape on your property. A C would be to roughly design or sketch out, map that trail, realizing that that's going to be rough, that's going to be flexible, it's not set in stone. You're going to temper that by moving on to D, to scouting the trail, looking at it on the landscape and just assessing its feasibility. Is it the best route? And then finally would be the actual constructing of the corridor, clearing the corridor and preparing the tread or trail surface in hopes that it meets the needs of whatever you're using it for, but also that it is done in a way that's going to be in harmony with the landscape, shed water effectively, and not result in a maintenance nightmare in the future. So we'll step through these, just have sections on each, and then we'll move on there to some of the obstacles. So identifying the need or purpose for constructing a trail. Landowners and user groups have a wide variety of needs. What is the intended use of this trail? Is it multi-use or is it more hiking, recreation? So if it is recreation, you need to have a clear understanding of what type of recreation is it? Is it multiple use? Are you going to be, doing hiking on it, but you're also going to be using your side-by-side or your snowmobile, cross-country skiing? Those clearing widths change based on what your intended use is, and your maintenance of those trails is also going to be dictated somewhat by what type of activities you're doing on them. So horseback riding might be a little more intensive on the landscape and require different surfacing, different clearing heights, etc. Is the trail or trail network on your property primarily for just accessing property for other activities? Maybe you have some selective timber harvest you're doing or timber stand improvement. Maybe you have backfields you need to access, hunting grounds. Maybe you do prescribe burns, and fire is something that you want to use as a management tool on your landscape, and sharing some of these trails as fire breaks is also a good idea. And what is the size of equipment that you're going to be needing to do some of these activities? Are you taking skidders in? You're going to need clearance for those, and are you using those as haul routes, etc. So, some early scoping and understanding just what type of equipment you're going to need here is, and how big a corridor or how high a corridor is important. Moving on to B, we'll do an assessment of the property or an inventory. And what that is we'll look at the size of the property. We'll look at what natural features and non-natural features, but what do we have on the property? Can we inventory, come up with a list, start to generate a map of where these are? So sensitive areas might be areas such as wetlands, vernal pools, if you're a little outside of where I am here in the Southeast. We don't have a lot of these, but small ephemeral pools, shorelines, unstable slopes, erodible soils, areas like that are commonly referenced as negative control points, areas we probably want to avoid. We'll also want to identify what the trail intends to connect or connect the user to, and that includes things like view sheds, shoreline access, some management areas or projects that you're working on, hunting areas, and those would be positive control points, the areas we want to carry the trail towards and can be in closer proximity. So other things that we'd want to inventory that are present are existing roads or old logging trails or skid roads and things that we can possibly utilize, or maybe that should be avoided if they're busier roads and we want to buffer ourselves from them. And we also want to identify additional resources that can aid us in layout of these trails and can help us kind of glean some information, whether it's on the steepness of the topography, rock outcrops, things like that. So a variety of online resources are available. Some that are particularly valuable are the county GIS parcel data. A lot of counties utilize Beacon, but these are GIS platforms that allow the public to view their parcel, their land, as well as some additional layers of interest. Those are often included are the 2-foot contours. A lot of times there's hill shade or some form of LIDAR, which is again just a hill shade, kind of a grayscale that really shows you how the topography varies, and we have very good resolution of that nowadays. Again, it includes your parcel boundaries and often has other transportation layers or layers of water resources, wetlands and things. Another good resource is DNR Land View. That will have current aerial imagery, probably within the last 5 years, but it'll also have some other layers available. And it will also, in many cases, have historic aerial photography. So you can, in some cases, see what your property looked like all the way back into the 30s. I think 38 might be the earliest, some of the earliest aerial imagery they have. And it's not comprehensive, but they do have it. USGS topo maps. USGS has a clearinghouse for topo maps. Those are downloadable. Those are the various quadrangle maps. You can do a query in there and just come up with a list. So Google Earth has resources. Another good one for soils would be the NRCS Web Soil Survey. And I will have links to, I think, all of these besides the county parcel data, because that's going to be unique to your individual county. But there'll be a list at the end of the presentation here. So moving on, we'll want to roughly design or sketch or create a map of our trail, what we picture in our head to be, the pattern or network of trail that we want on our property. So again, what is the desired pattern and what length, and is it conforming to our purpose or intended use? So different types of trail design allow for different user experiences, but again, this might be more of a multiple use or an access for management. So those are all things to consider. Just listing a few things out here. Loops avoid backtracking, better flow, more length to area. We can create a little bit more diversity in the trail by using cutoffs. But again, those are good options for things like cross-country skiing or even hiking through your property, where maybe we don't want to backtrack. Maybe we want to just keep good flow through the trail. Some linear trails are good for traversing longer distances, field edges, open fields, but also straightaways are usually how we approach or cross roads if you have road crossings associated. I'm guessing maybe a lot of you don't, but there is the potential. Spurs, as you'll see in the next slide, spurs are just these shoot off trails, typically dead ends, go to, we're used to them going off to logging landings or things, but often they could be used to either access a destination or, they're good ideas for shoreline access, where we don't want to just put in the trail paralleling the shoreline for long distances. We want just little shootouts to the shoreline, spur trails like that. And it's good to identify entrance points, especially if you're located off of a well-used road. Entrance points typically invite things like vandalism or trespass, as well as garbage often. So it's one thing if you're accessing your trail network from your house. If it's, you own 80 acres somewhere that's you don't live by, you may want to, be sure that entrances to trail networks aren't inviting some off-road vehicle use or trespassing or people throwing their litter. So another big thing to pay attention to as you're sketching things out is, does your trail appear to conform with topography? What we really want to avoid is trails that go straight up and down the slope, and you'll see it a few times in here, but I'll refer to fall line trails. And fall line trails are those trails that do run up and down the slope. And what they're going to be is maintenance nightmares. All they are is an unimpeded funnel for water. And with that comes a lot of erosion, a lot of surface material loss, and impacts to things like water resources. So, when I say, does it conform with topography, that more or less means, does it attempt to follow the natural contours of the landscape and not perpendicular or, go straight up and down the slope. So grade, most folks I'm sure have heard that term, but it's just a vertical rise over horizontal run. It's the slope, and we generally express it as a percent when we're talking about trails and roadways and things. So generally there's a rule that your average grade shouldn't exceed 10% in trail construction. And 10% isn't again the steepest that your trail should be. It is just that your trail should more or less an averaged out over the whole length, not exceed 10%. Short stints up and down are great, a little bit steeper, but we're shooting for that 10%. So, and we're also looking at obstacles, sensitive resources, things like water crossing shorelines, where we know they're rare species, rock outcroppings that we're not going to be able to bench across or get around easily. We'll want to avoid erodible soils, wet soils, and busier road crossings. So continuing on this, here's a little example sketch of just a proposed trail network kind of in my area here down in Goodhue County. And we've just mapped out some features. You can see up by Deer Camp, there's a little spur trail. And in most cases, aside from one spot on the very east western edge by the ginseng patch, where the trail actually goes and cuts down perpendicular to the contours, and that would be the steepest part of the trail. Aside from that, most of this trail typically follows the contours, and we're kind of listing out sensitive resources, things we would want to note on the map. Along with this is a 1 to 24,000 USGS topo map that I just pulled offline off of the USGS site. But using this, we can also get some information about our slopes. So topographic maps, as I say here, can be helpful for siting trails and trying to hit those appropriate grades or slopes. So here I've got an example of just how to determine what map length you need, drawing a line on your map between contours to hit a 10% slope or less. I don't need to go through it all. It's a pretty straightforward little equation here. You just need to know your contour intervals, which they usually list on topo maps, your target grade, which in this case I said was 10%. So we do the math out there, 10-foot intervals, 10 divided by 10 times 100 is 100 feet. So 100 feet times, so 100 feet we would need between contour intervals to hit that 10% grade, which you could do that math in your head, and then we just extrapolate it out through that 1 to 2,000 scale, which is 1 to 24 equals 1 inch equals 2,000 feet here. If we do the math there, 100 times 1 over 2,000 equals 500ths of an inch, which is small, but it's depending on what your target grades are, maybe you want 5% or things. It's just giving you an idea of how to target your slopes or your grade on the map. D would be, the next step is to take that information you've got there, bring it out in the field. Again, you've probably already been there once, at least doing an inventory, and look at how that trail flows on the ground. Walk the proposed corridor, note the obstacles, make sure everything could be cleared to suitable height and width for the intended use. A few notes is this is best done during leaf off. That route could be sketched on a map, and if you have a GPS unit, using the tracks feature is a good way to trace your route as well, or you can kind of just breadcrumb GPS points along the way. Paying attention as you do it, does it follow the natural contours, avoiding those fall line trail sections, shooting for that average 10% grade. And We could do this using a clinometer, protractors. I'll explain how to kind of do a rough clinometer using a protractor. And you could use topo maps all in helping your grade determination. There's also something called the half rule that you should pay attention to, and that's a trail grade typically shouldn't exceed half of the slope of the hillside it's on. So if you've got a 50% slope, you shouldn't have stretches in your trail that exceed that 20, what would be 25% there. So that's just a rule of thumb. It's not hard and fast. It's just going to help you have a sustainable trail that requires a lot less maintenance, and adjust the route as needed to avoid problematic or sensitive areas. Again, paying special attention to stream crossings and wetlands, low-lying areas that are going to be problematic for maintenance, and unstable slopes, and then mark that route with pin flags or flagging tape. Tools to use, I mentioned the clinometer. In the picture here, you'll see that. It's easy to use, but they're slightly expensive, and if you're not using them on a routine basis, they might not be the best choice. You can create almost the same thing, a rough one with a protractor and a string and a fishing weight, almost using them using that as a plumb bob there. So hanging from the midpoint of the protractor and sighting across the flat end or the bottom of the protractor, shooting at something upslope at eye level, and you'll be able to examine the angle on the side and use that angle following the steps here to convert your angle in degrees over to slope. And there's an example here at the bottom, and there's instructions online on how to do this. It's a pretty straightforward exercise, but slopes are something we want to try to get fairly close to and not just eyeball. We want to try to get these fairly close, and these are a few ways to do it. You can always use levels for things like outslope or shorter distances, but the clinometer is a good tool, and using a protractor is another one, but trying to make sure we're at least getting an estimate of our slope. So, and then we move on to clearing the trail corridor and preparing the tread. So there's a variety of things we can use to do this. They include hand tools, shovels, picks, mattocks, basic hand saws, chainsaws, loppers. And then we move into tractors, brush mowers, walk behind mowers for thicker brush removal. And some of the walk behind mowers will take things up to 1.5 inches or 2 inches. Some of the brush hogs and things, you can get up to 3. Also using skidders or box blades and things, or different blades, dozers, skid loaders. Depending on where you are, there's options there, and what your topography and soils are like. There's also smaller walk behind earth movers from Ditch Witch and things that you can usually rent by the day and things. It really depends on the scale of what you're trying to get in. If you're trying to recover an old logging road down in the southeast, you may be renting out for some dozer work. Since most of those were dozed in initially, they can often be bladed off there, and you can get a decent outslope on those. But for smaller trails, it's just economies of scale here, and a lot can be done with hand tools and fairly cost effectively. So remove only the trees needed. Pay attention to clearing height and width, especially at turns, realizing you might need more room there. Trees should always be flush cut if they're in the trail. Hardwood stumps most likely will require some herbicide treatment to the stump to prevent resprouting. And one note is, depending on where you are in the state, you should avoid trying to damage or cut live oaks really between March and October. The sap's flowing. And again, that depends on where you are in the state, but really what we're looking for is to try to preclude the transmission of oak wilt, especially into your woodland, because if you get it in there, that's going to be catastrophic. If you have got predominantly oak woodland, you can easily lose, especially if you've got red oaks, quite a good deal of them on your landscape. And down here in the southeast is the big issue. As you move farther west and north, it may be of less of an issue, but you can consult the oak wilt maps that the DNR typically publishes. And I know they've got a Oak Wilt management webpage, and I'm sure the U of M does as well. So here's just some examples of tools we'd be using. The McLeod rake, we use it for fire, but that's a pretty invaluable trail building tool for hand work. You can tamp with it, you can rake with it, you can hoe with it. It's very sturdy, it's got good weight. The DR walk behind brush mower is a great option for trail corridors, either punching them in or maintaining them along the edges. Great for invasive species work. The Acres pull behind mower, it's got its use. It's got a nice wide deck. It's good to pull behind a UTV or ATV. Both are gas powered. I think the DR is 20 horse. The Woods brush pull rotary mower is PTO driven, sits on the 3-point. That's good for larger stuff, takes up to about 3 inches. And then mini excavators and things all function well for construction and maintenance, depending again on the scale of what work you're doing. So a few more notes on just clearing the trail, preparing the tread. When constructing on hillsides, make sure to incorporate these elements. Outslope is critically important. If you can get adequate outslope, you'll push water across your trail as sheet flow. It won't collect on the treadway, create ponding and compaction and things. So really trying to get a good outslope on your trail will save you a lot in the long run. Trying to incorporate grade reversals, and those are just what the name implies. They're, you're reversing the grade. If you're going up slope, you want to drop down slope for a little bit, try to follow a natural contour to do it, or a natural dip in the topography. And these little reversals in grade allow some water to shed off the trail using these dips in topography, and they limit contributing basin area or catchment area. So trying to keep those small. Incorporating the half rule, which we said before, the trail grade should be less than half the overall hill slope. And then maximum sustainable grade relative to topography. Generally, we shoot for a maximum sustainable grade at 15 to 20%. These are little short shots, not overall. Again, we want to shoot for that 10%, overall treadway slope. And then with that outslope of 3 to 5%. Outslope means you're just dumping water off the side at that 3 to 5%. And then we always want to be sure to compact or tamp the trail surface and the back slope when we're done. So if we bench in a trail, it doesn't need to be a deep bench, but we want to make sure those surfaces are tamped down. So moving on to just addressing some obstacles in trail construction. Identifying and addressing obstacles during construction and layout, it's really going to save you time and money and maintenance and headaches and things like that in the future. And it's also going to, minimize ecological impacts to your woodland. So constructing a trail right really is the way to do it. Those trails will stay on the landscape for a long time, but they'll also just be cohesive with the landscape, and you'll find a lot more enjoyment out of them being there, and they'll function better and help you get your work done as well. So obstacles to trail construction and maintenance are most often, as I said earlier, associated with water, but also they're associated with your soils and soil properties. So not going to read through it, but the table on the right is just a little resource for you to look through your just to assess soils pretty quickly, their drainage rates and water holding and compactability. So a few things, the obstacles I'm going to go through here involve subsurface drainage. So those are subsurface drainage issues are, soils that drain poorly, often involved ponding, rutting, compaction. Those usually what we see in those areas with poor subsurface drainage. We'll also look at some surface drainage issues more involved in steep slopes. And usually this is surface drainage issues or water moving across the landscape or over the landscape, as well as opposed to subsurface drainage issues, which usually are involved in infiltration of water. And then we'll look at some stream crossing issues as well. Those are obstacles if we have to cross a water feature. Often if we do that poorly, we can contribute to bank failure, crossing washouts, sedimentation, and water quality impacts. So we want to use care when we're tasked with doing that. So first is subsurface drainage issues. These are, areas that are poorly draining. They're wet, they're low lying. If we put trails through them, we often get ponding on the trails, which leads to trail creep or widening as people try to walk around these wet areas. So some ways to address this: we can first off avoid the area during construction. If we would have identified that and went around it, if we have that ability, we'll be more successful. Alternatives are elevating the trail, removing soils along the trail, but removing soils along the trail and use them to create center crowning, or elevate the trail and then center crown it, so outslope it so things shed off the trail. Alternatively, we can install boardwalks or consider rerouting the trail to higher ground. And just a quick sketch, this would be an example, like a exaggerated example of center crowning, where we cut material off the sides of the trail, built up that trail elevation, the trail base, and then use gravel surfacing typically and try to outslope at 2 to 3%, creating a center crown, a peak in that trailway. But in these cases, it's often pretty material intensive, and we generally want to use these for shorter stretches. Some of the fill material for this can be larger rock, like quarry spalls and things, which would allow some water to pass. But again, this is elevating trails. If you've got materials to do it, you can do it. But ultimately, the best way to address this is to avoid these areas during construction. So we talked about surface drainage issues as well on steep slopes, hillside trails. So this is the arrow is indicating outslope towards the downhill. We have 3 to 5% outslope. This is a slightly benched trail. It's full bench with a slight outslope. It allows water to sheet flow off in the downhill direction. So surface drainage issues arise when flow gets concentrated or gets stuck on the trail and starts moving down the treadway. We often end up with gulling, berm creation, trail creep. Berm is when you get basically a berm that builds on the downside of the trail. So we want to avoid that. It helps contain water on the treadway. Trail creep, like I said, is people avoid wet spots, so we'll widen the trail if berms develop and water collects. So some ways we can get around having these surface drainage issues are to avoid constructing fall line trails. So avoid trails that run up and down the slope, directly up and down the slope. We can construct full bench trails on steeper hillsides, and it doesn't need to be a steep hillside. We still want to construct a full bench trail because that allows us to, if we have that trail benched in, we can get some control on where that water goes. But again, we work with the contours of the hillside. Confirm or create adequate outslope. Again, that 3 to 5%, like the arrow suggests, water is going to shed off as sheets, not concentrate. Install grade reversals, as we talked about during, but if you haven't got them in when you construct, you can try to go in and install those after the fact. Install or maintain rolling dips and nicks to periodically drain water, and we'll talk about those in the upcoming slide here. And then during trail maintenance, you want to deberm cup trails or inslope trails. So removing that outer edge of built up soil on the outslope so that water can sheet flow off. So another big obstacle is fall line trails. They're easy, they're a quick point from A to B, but more trail length often means that we're tempering that slope. It's going to be more gradual slope. So fall line trails, generally, as you see in the picture, we've got a little gully or washout going right down the middle of the trail in that picture where the leaves are collected. Water moves immediately down. It moves down the path of least resistance. The water picks up velocity. It ends up increasing erosion and gulling. We lose a lot of material on these. These are ones we end up grading over and over again, putting material in, losing it. Again, chronic maintenance, often unusable conditions, and we end up with resource damage. So solutions to this are installing grade reversals where possible or rerouting the trail. People like to use water bars, but they're not considered a sustainable solution because those typically clog, they require frequent maintenance, and they often fail themselves or cause people to want to walk around when they're not working. In order to address this, I had mentioned installing a full bench trail. Here's an exaggerated sketch of a full bench trail. Again, it's going to follow that natural contour of the hillside. It sheds water as sheet flow across the tread versus carrying it down the trail, as in those fall line trail examples. They're more stable than cut and fill trail, where you're actually building the treadway on top of fill material. As you can see in the picture, we're side casting fill material down off the trail. And depending on the soil type, you know, we might need different backslope heights, but generally they require much less maintenance when they're correctly installed, especially when we get nicks or rolling dips incorporated. So here's an example of a grade reversal to address, you know, a steeper slope and hillside drainage. So all grade reversal is, as you can see, is we're dipping a negative slope in there and then picking it up again and using that as a way to shed water off the trail. Usually it takes advantage of natural dips in the topography. And again, it's limiting catchment area. So only so much water is being contributed into that area and shed off the trail, but it does require adequate outsloping so that water does sheet off. So again, here's water bars. The picture here, it's difficult to see, but there is one partially functioning water bar in that picture. Again, I stress this is a last resort. These are intended just to limit the catchment area and create kickouts for water. They need to be installed correctly, high enough, and maintained, kept clean in order for them to be functional. They should be placed at a 30 to 45 degree angle within the trail or across the trail tread. They can be constructed of various materials. This one in the picture is log, but rock often works a little bit better. You can often create earthen humps too that do something similar. As I said, they often clog. A better idea would be to replace these with a rolling dip or a nick. And as the trail gets steeper, you're going to need more. So the frequency with how often you're going to need them is going to increase. And people like to step around them when they don't function right, so they widen the trail. So I wouldn't consider these sustainable, but as you can see, the 25% trail, you're going to need them every 40 feet, if not more. Even on a 2% slope trail, which is a very low slope, every 250 feet, just in order to truncate your catchment area and just keep water from running straight line down. So as examples of nicks and rolling dips on a hillside, I made this graphic. You can see nicks, they're short, about 10 feet, often semicircular. They're kind of a scrape out, a little bowl in the trail that's quite a bit steeper than that 3 to 5% outslope, but it allows water to release in a more concentrated point. If they're done frequently enough, and it doesn't need to be extremely frequent, but it does allow for that water to not concentrate in mass, and it allows it just to move off onto stable forest soils. Rolling dips, it's a similar concept, sometimes referred to as the soup spoon, but what you do is, as you scrape out that material from your nick, you use it to build a ramp out on the downhill, and that just prevents water from ever kind of flowing around, creates a gradual ramp out. So you attempt to locate these in natural undulations, both of these, and they kind of are used simultaneously. They're easy to install with hand tools and easy to maintain. Minimal maintenance, usually just a little bit of clean out. So looking at some water crossing structures, water crossings are going to be another obstacle. Generally, we can use culverts, bridges, fords, structures, various materials. Cost-wise, they can get pretty expensive. Culverts and bridges, they all need to be sized and installed appropriately. If they're not functional due to poor installation, they're likely going to be a failure. They're going to be a maintenance nightmare, and they're eventually probably going to allow that trail to wash out. So, often even just seasonal, what appears to be dry drainage way most of the year, swales will need some kind of crossing. So, and you'll see, I've got a few examples of wooden crossing structures I like to install a little more than the conventional culverts. You need to make sure that your culverts are at suitable capacity, that it will pass almost a 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 year event. If not, you're going to overtop your trail, and that's ultimately going to result in failure. And they need to be installed, like I said, correctly. The approach, I shouldn't say the crossing should be perpendicular, but you should approach that crossing perpendicular to the channel. In many cases, especially for perennial streams, you may need a permit, especially if it's a public waters. So you should consult with the DNR, your area hydrologist. If you have questions, you can look up your closest DNR area office and inquire there. So like I said, there's various options. Sometimes the option is no crossing structure. You can ford some streams. If they're dry and they've got a stable bed, we might not need anything. Plastic and metal culverts, again, various diameters. If they're poorly placed, they'll clog, they'll wash out. Wooden culverts, I'm using them more. They allow for a range of flows to pass, and these are better options for trails, smaller trails, things that you can get a tractor over still, but they're buildable on site and a good option for seasonal sites. And we'll look at a few examples of these. So in this picture, we're looking at a poorly installed and undersized metal culvert. It is non-functional. There's a washout along the backside of this pipe. The pipe was installed off alignment with the channel. So the channel actually pushes in to the fill material adjacent to the pipe. It was also installed too high with inadequate fill. There's no armoring on the back. And while it's on a seasonal stream and undersized for conditions, well, it's on a seasonal stream and undersized for annual conditions, so it clogs. And ultimately, this pipe overtopped, washed the treadway material off, and failed completely. The pipe ended up downstream. Here's an example of some wood culverts we constructed. Easily constructed on site, dimensional lumber. We used treated lumber. They're 2.5 by 8 foot. The deck is segmented, so it actually will pass flow over the top, but allow water to go through the deck. It passes a bobcat, skid steer. We've probably got up to about 10,000 pounds over these crossings. They're durable. They're open bottom, so they allow a range of flows to pass and clog less often. And they're often good in unconfined areas. So areas where you might have a kind of diffuse channel, or maybe areas that pond seasonally and you need to get drainage on either side of the trail without it backing up. These are great options there. And they can also be constructed open top. You can fill them with rock, things like that. There are various options here. Here's another example of a larger wood deck that we built on a stabilized head cut. We built a retaining wall using limestone we just picked off of an old quarry that was within walking distance. It's a seasonal stream, but it does flow pretty well. This is a 12-foot deck installed and built on site. We laid it over geotextile fabric, and this one also supports over 7,500 pounds. It's gotten up to about 10,000. And then we drilled pilots and then pounded rebar in to get it anchored in, but it was heavy enough to sit pretty flush. And it was constructed, all of this was constructed with hand tools in one day with a crew of 3 people. So, and as you can see on that bottom picture, it's on a very steep slope, and that's a bedrock cliff right there. So very stable, but allows for a wide range. You can see how wide it is. It's about 10 feet of passage underneath from side to side. So it does what it needs to. And those were just a few examples. A few brief slides on trail maintenance. And if we look at the top statement there, that's why this section is going to be brief. If sustainable trail design elements are utilized during trail construction, trail maintenance should generally be limited to pruning of adjacent vegetation and maintaining your corridor for clearance and invasive control. Limited clean out of those nicks and rolling dips like we talked about, any accumulated soil, organic matter. You could rake it out. Like I said, I like the McLeod rakes. Just going through your trail network and doing a little clean out with a few friends can get you a long way. Checking crossing structures to make sure they're free of debris. Then depending on the trail surfacing that you've got, you can mow or do light brushing if the tread's vegetated. Again, a lot of people maintain their trails with mowers. This is mostly focused on woodlands, so it might be a mix of things. Another good option is dragging a chain harrow. This often helps regrade that trail. Sometimes you might need a box blade if you've got a larger trail that you use heavier stuff on to run over and then drag the trail. These are varying prices, varying sizes. A lot of them are pulled behind an ATV. You can get a tine harrow that is reversible, so you can drag it with the tines down to get a little more of an aggressive grade on it. But depending on where your site is, how rocky it is, how many roots are exposed, you can just, drag chains. And these are pretty easily constructed as well. If you've got old log chains or things, also chain link fence with a bunch of weight on it, even bolting together a bunch of old tires, fill them with rock or concrete works. But dragging something to just kind of function like, the road grader. Just getting your tread leveled and getting those irregularities out and maintaining that surface. A few cases where additional maintenance might be needed is if you have fall line trails. If you have those, you're undoubtedly going to be doing maintenance. So you might be cleaning and resetting water bars every month. If possible, you might want to try to do some grade reversals or create some nicks in there. You want to repair gullying, all the lost material, and you should constantly be thinking about rerouting those segments. If your trail lacks outslope and water isn't moving effectively off the trail, you'll want to try to recreate that outslope, either using hand tools or blading, but just trying to get that adequate outslope. This activity can include deberming or kind of reducing that buildup on the outside edge of your slope so that water sheets off. And a lot of that can be done with hand tools. If your trail's chronically wet or rutting, you want to build up the elevation through that wet segment, or again, consider rerouting. And if your trail's widening, which is what we call trail creep, that it's probably due to users leaving the trail to avoid obstacles. So if a tree falls, clear it out of the trail so the trail doesn't change its course around that. Or users change the trail's course around that. If there's a wet area, you need to address the wet area. Otherwise, your trail is going to constantly widen around those wet areas. So, and then a few notes just on invasive species prevention and control. So, actively controlling invasives on your property is going to help you maintain, the ecological integrity and function, the wildlife habitat value, and the ability for you to enjoy that woodland. You want to make sure you know what's on your property. When we went through that inventory at the beginning, it's good during that process, or if you haven't done it yet, to inventory what invasives you have. Learn them, learn a little bit about their phenology and ecology, and learn how to treat them or control them. EdMaps, I'll have a link at the end of this, is an online resource that helps you identify and catalog and map invasives. It's got resources in there for treatment as well. You can download it to your phone, take pictures, upload them right to it. It would help you. You can create maps of your property on there as well. But always ensure that if you're using equipment to create and maintain trails, that it's clean when you use it, especially if it's going off site. So that includes mowers and heavy equipment, but also any fill material that you bring onto your property. You want to make sure that's weed free. And when doing brushing and mowing or dragging, you always want to work, if you know you've got infested areas of your property with say buckthorn, you'll want to start in areas that are clean and work towards those infested areas. So you're not dragging seed out of those infested areas and into cleaner areas. And then educate yourself on the timing of activities and when the best time to do those is in relation to what invasives you might have on your property. So I give the example here of, say you have garlic mustard, Dame's rocket, they're setting seed through June, the seeds getting viable towards the end of June. And if you go through and mow in July, you're going to be shattering seed everywhere and trailing it all over your property. And what might have been a small problem is going to turn into a much larger one. And then just a few notes on control, target control in the lighter infested areas and work towards those more heavily infested areas. You're going to make progress. You're going to keep it out of, working in sensitive areas to keep those clean is good, a good idea. A lot of times floodplains are constantly getting their seed bank replenished. I would say, pick your battles. If you're working in the floodplain, you might not be in the right spot if you've got invasive species, similar invasive species above you in the watershed that are going to keep flushing down. And then woody invasives like buckthorn and honeysuckle, again, you're going to need to treat and follow up with those stumps, otherwise they'll resprout. You want to target the berry producers first, get those that are causing you the problems out of there. And a picture on the right is a buckthorn blaster. They're pretty cheap. You fill them with herbicide. They've got a roller top and you just raise a stick in your pocket. And if you lop off a buckthorn on your property, you just dab it with that and get that cambium, and it's hopefully one and done. So, and then the final note is just prevention through early detection is always the cheaper and easier option versus control. So those are just a few notes there. And kind of with that, I'm wrapping up here. So this last slide is just some online resources. So I know this is recorded, so everybody can take their time and take a look at each of these. But some good resources, like I said, USGS topo maps, land view, web soil survey. There's the EdMaps link there for invasive species and some other trail resources. So that's all I have, and I appreciate everyone for tuning in. Sorry it went a little long here, but yeah, hopefully there was some good information you guys can get out of that and take out to your woodlands.